The evening sky over Toronto was growing darker, with heavy clouds gathering as Marianne Stewart opened the door to her parents' house on Yonge Street. She could never have imagined that this family gathering would shatter their lives, leaving behind only shock, betrayal, and heartbreak. Marianne was prepared for another regular family meetup, unaware that her life was about to take a drastic turn when she would stumble upon evidence of the greatest betrayal she had ever faced. In the spacious living room, most of the family had already gathered. Parents, brothers, sisters, their spouses and children filled the room with laughter and cheerful voices. But beneath this appearance of familial bliss lay something dark and ominous. Marianne noticed the way her husband, Paul, was looking at her younger sister, Rebecca. There was something about their exchanged glances that unsettled her, something indescribably off. This uneasy feeling lodged itself in her mind as she sat on the couch, trying to smile but sinking deeper into suspicion. While everyone was enjoying the wine and conversation, Marianne decided to take a break in the bedroom upstairs to clear her mind. There, she happened to come across Paul's phone, left unattended on the dresser. He'd forgotten to lock the screen, and a notification had popped up, a message from Rebecca. Curiosity flared up and easily overcame her fear of learning the truth. She opened it. What she found shocked her to her core. Texts, photos, and words of affection that she saw in their conversation shattered her world. Returning to the living room with a pale face, Marianne couldn't contain herself any longer. With her voice trembling, she announced Paul and Rebecca's affair to everyone present. The atmosphere, moments earlier filled with laughter and nostalgia, erupted into chaos. People who had been joyfully reminiscing were now paralyzed by horror and disbelief. Paul tried to explain, but his words drowned in the uproar and sobbing. Rebecca, standing there with trembling hands and tears in her eyes, couldn't find the words to justify her betrayal. After the revelation, the gathering ended in absolute turmoil. Marianne fled the house, barely noticing her surroundings. Her head was filled with fragmented memories, phrases, and the promises she and Paul had made to each other. A light rain began to fall, intensifying her sense of emptiness and despair. She got into her car and drove away without any particular destination, just as long as she could get far away from the place that had suddenly become alien and hostile. The next day, an uncomfortable silence filled the Stewart household. Her parents didn't know how to react to what had happened, and Rebecca locked herself in her room, avoiding all contact. Paul tried reaching out to Marianne, but she ignored his calls and messages. All he could do was sit in their empty apartment and ponder where it had all gone wrong. Meanwhile, Marianne contacted the authorities. Her suspicions had grown into a certainty that there was something far more sinister behind this affair. She remembered the strange late-night calls and Paul's frequent trips, which he'd claimed were for work. The police initially didn't take her seriously, but after she provided screenshots of their exchanges, they decided to start an investigation. The police called Paul and Rebecca in for questioning. During the interviews, they found several discrepancies in their stories. Paul and Rebecca provided conflicting information about their whereabouts over the past few months. Their meetings on the outskirts of Toronto, particularly in an area known for its abandoned buildings and secluded streets, seemed especially suspicious. The authorities began tracking their activities and eventually discovered an old warehouse on the industrial edge of the city that Paul had rented under his name. This place had never appeared in their family finances, and even Rebecca seemed unaware of its existence. When the investigative team entered, they found evidence pointing to something much darker than a simple affair. In a corner of the warehouse stood a locked metal container. Inside, they found numerous documents and photographs, some clearly connected to financial transactions and suspicious dealings. There were fake passports, large sums of cash, and photos of Paul and Rebecca with unidentified individuals. This discovery led the police to believe there might be a major crime involved, possibly money laundering or something even more dangerous. The deeper the investigation went, the more secrets emerged. Marianne, feeling partly responsible for everything that had happened, tried to assist the authorities by providing everything she knew about Paul and his connections. She recalled how Paul had spoken about a project that would secure their future. Back then, she hadn't given it much thought, but now those conversations took on a whole new meaning. Paul had obviously been living a double life, and Rebecca was just one part of his complex and risky game. The situation escalated when information surfaced about the strange disappearance of one of Paul's co-workers. This person, who had worked with him at a construction company, had gone missing several months earlier. At the time, it didn't draw much attention, but now it all looked different. The police began connecting the disappearance to Paul's activities and his hidden financial dealings. Marianne found herself caught up in a whirlwind of events from which there was no escape. Her life had become a constant cycle of trips to the police station, interviews, and meetings with lawyers. She couldn't believe that the person she trusted the most had turned out not only to be a traitor, but potentially a dangerous criminal. Her sister, who had once seemed so close, now represented nothing but betrayal and pain. Investigators kept digging, slowly unraveling the web of lies and crime. Every new day brought more revelations, and they all pointed back to one person, Paul Stewart. His life, which he had kept so carefully hidden from Marianne, turned out to be filled with shady deals, risky associations, and criminal plots. Rebecca, it seemed, wasn't just a victim of manipulation. Her role in this story was far more active than anyone might have guessed. The investigation led the police to start tracking down everyone connected to Paul. It turned out his contacts included people of questionable reputation, linked to underground financial operations and criminal organizations. Marianne realized that her family had become entangled in something far scarier than just a family betrayal. Every day, she woke up with a sense of fear and uncertainty, not knowing how this investigation would end or who else would be drawn into the nightmare. The day after Paul and Rebecca's questioning, the police came to Marianne's house. They requested that she accompany them for another interview. Marianne felt exhausted, but she understood she had no choice but to dive back into this nightmare. The police station greeted her with the cold light of fluorescent lamps and the stern looks of investigators. This time, the questioning was much more intense. Clearly, the investigators had more information than before. They started asking her about suspicious calls, Paul's contacts, and his frequent trips. Marianne shared everything she knew, and then the investigator showed her surveillance photos. One of them showed Paul entering one of the abandoned buildings on the outskirts of the city. Marianne felt a cold sweat on her forehead. She could see from the photos that Paul wasn't alone. A man was standing next to him, though his face wasn't clearly visible. The investigator added that this man was connected to a criminal organization suspected of money laundering. Marianne realized the situation was getting more dangerous. Paul was involved in something far more serious than she had imagined. The police also played her fragments of phone conversations they had intercepted. In one of the calls, Paul discussed a delivery of merchandise with someone. The tone and content of the conversation clearly hinted at illegal activities. In that moment, Marianne felt her world had finally crumbled. The police decided to search their apartment. Marianne watched as the investigators combed through every room, pulling items out of closets, overturning furniture. In one of the boxes hidden in the storage room, they found documents related to offshore accounts and large sums of cash. It was yet more proof that Paul had led a double life, and his involvement in criminal activities was deeper than anyone had expected. Meanwhile, Rebecca seemed to be trying to disappear. She avoided all contact with family and friends, didn't show up at work, and wasn't answering calls. The police also wanted to bring her in for questioning again, but she had simply vanished. This made investigators suspect her role in the situation was larger than they initially thought. They began to consider that Rebecca might not only have known about Paul's illegal activities, but could have been an active participant. Marianne was completely bewildered. She didn't know whom to trust or what to do next. Every day brought new and horrifying revelations, and she felt herself sinking deeper into this swamp of lies and betrayal. Her life would never be the same again. The Paul she loved and trusted turned out to be a monster, and her sister, his accomplice. The police continued to dig into the investigation. They found that the warehouse Paul had rented was being used for secret meetings with people whose reputations were less than stellar. Investigators began identifying these people, and found that most were linked to a major network involving money laundering and smuggling. Paul wasn't just a low-level participant, he was a significant link in the chain. The investigation moved forward slowly but surely. Each new detail, each new witness added pieces to the puzzle. It was becoming clear that Paul and Rebecca weren't simply involved in an affair. Their relationship was part of something much larger. A complex scheme involving money laundering, fraud, and possibly even violence. Paul used his position at the construction company to set up illegal deals, and Rebecca helped cover his tracks. Things took a new turn when one of Paul's acquaintances, whom the investigators had tracked down for questioning, was found dead in his home. Initially, the police considered it a case of self-harm, but soon found evidence of a struggle. This death became a turning point in the investigation. Now, the detectives knew that those behind the scheme were willing to do whatever it took to cover their tracks. Marianne started fearing for her own life. She realized she knew too much, and those involved in the crimes might see her as a threat. She began noticing strange things. Cars parked outside her house for hours, unfamiliar people who seemed to be watching her. She reached out to the police for protection, and they assigned her a security detail. At the same time, investigators discovered that Paul was planning to leave the country. They found tickets for a flight to Mexico, booked under his name and Rebecca's. This meant they were planning to run, leaving all this chaos behind. The police decided to act swiftly to prevent their escape. They set up surveillance on Paul's apartment and started preparing an operation to apprehend him. Marianne knew she had to stay strong. She decided to cooperate with the police until the end, despite the fears and threats. Her life had been destroyed, but she couldn't let these people get away with their crimes. Each day was like a battle for truth, a battle for justice, a battle for her own future. The police finally conducted the operation to arrest Paul. It happened late at night as he was attempting to leave the apartment, a small bag in hand. Investigators rushed into the building and arrested him on the staircase. Paul didn't resist, but his face was dark and cold. He knew his game was up. However, Rebecca managed to escape. She seemed to vanish without a trace, and the police had no leads on her whereabouts. This added even more intrigue to the investigation. Where could she have gone? Who had helped her disappear? Marianne didn't know if she would ever see her sister again, and if she did, in what light, as a traitor or as a victim. The investigation continued, and the deeper they went into this dark labyrinth, the clearer it became that Paul and Rebecca were just the tip of the iceberg. There were others behind them, far more powerful and dangerous people. Marianne felt that their story was far from over, and that ahead lay new trials and revelations that would change her life forever. Hits of dead-end weeks had passed since Paul's arrest, but instead of getting closer to the truth, the investigation seemed to have stalled. Each passing day made it more challenging to untangle the web of lies and intrigue. Every new lead led to a dead end, and attempts to find Rebecca proved fruitless. Investigators tried in vain to piece together the available information, but it seemed like they were moving in circles. Marianne lived in constant tension, knowing her life would never be the same. She remained under 24-hour protection, feeling like a prisoner in her own home. Each new day brought disappointment. The news from the police contained nothing concrete, and her hopes that the truth would come to light were slowly fading. Investigators kept summoning Marianne for questioning, trying to find new details. But each time their questions felt more like desperate attempts to grasp at straws. They asked about childhood memories, Paul's friends, and small oddities she hadn't previously noticed. She tried to help, but she realized their efforts were in vain. She no longer knew what else she could say to move the investigation forward. Paul, held in custody, refused to cooperate. He remained silent, meeting all accusations with a calm demeanor. His attorneys built their defense on the lack of sufficient evidence, even attempting to portray Marianne as someone prone to hysteria, arguing that her claims were driven by personal emotions and jealousy. This line of defense left Marianne feeling even more helpless and vulnerable. Rebecca remained on the run, and the police were sure someone was helping her hide. They checked her contacts, friends, and co-workers, but no one knew where she might be. The investigation had reached a dead end, and even the best analysts brought in to help couldn't find the missing link that would make sense of everything. Investigators began to suspect that they might be missing a crucial piece of the puzzle, without which nothing else would add up. One of the main questions haunting the police was Paul's motive. Why would he get involved in such dangerous activities? What secrets was he hiding? And why was Rebecca involved? The investigators tried to find answers, but even questioning his co-workers and friends yielded nothing useful. Everyone described Paul as a calm, hard-working man who always stayed away from trouble. Sometimes it seemed like all these events were just a bad dream, a nightmare from which there was no waking up. Marianne tried to return to her normal life, but each morning began with thoughts of Paul and Rebecca, of how they could betray her and their family. She felt like she was suffocating and often thought she was trapped with no way out. The police, unable to get anywhere with Paul, turned their attention to finding other possible participants in the scheme. They began reviewing old cases related to money laundering, fraud, and illegal activities, hoping to find any connection to Paul. But time went on, and they still had no results. Meanwhile, Marianne decided to take matters into her own hands. She knew she couldn't just sit around and wait for the police to find answers. She started digging through Paul's old documents, reviewing photos, messages, trying to find even the smallest clue. One day, she remembered that Paul had an old laptop he hadn't used in a long time. It was stored in the closet, and Marianne decided to check it. After hours of trying different passwords, she finally managed to access the system. Most of the files were insignificant. Old work documents, photos, personal notes. But in one hidden folder, she found an encrypted file. It turned out to be a list of contacts Marianne had never seen before. Some of them were signed with strange aliases, with amounts of money and dates written next to them. Marianne realized she had found something important. She immediately handed the laptop over to the police, and investigators began analyzing the data. This new lead gave them a chance to reinvigorate the investigation. However, the situation remained extremely complicated. They couldn't determine who these people were, or what role they played in Paul and Rebecca's lives. A few more weeks went by, and the investigation seemed to hit another roadblock. The contacts they had found led to no concrete results. Some of these people were located and questioned, but they claimed to know nothing about Paul or his activities. Others had disappeared or been found dead, adding even more mystery to the unfolding events. Marianne began losing faith that the truth would ever come out. Her life had turned into a series of endless waiting and disappointments. She felt entirely alone in this world, surrounded by lies and betrayal. Her family was struggling too. Marianne's parents tried to support her, but it was difficult for them to accept that one of their daughters could be involved in a crime. Investigators, in turn, began suspecting that someone in their own ranks might be helping Rebecca stay hidden. They checked for leaks within their team but found nothing. It seemed like Rebecca knew their every move in advance, which raised serious concerns. Maybe someone close to her was far more informed than they appeared to be. At one point, the police decided to change tactics. They began working closely with other law enforcement agencies, involving international organizations in the investigation. It turned out that some of Paul's contacts had ties overseas, opening up new opportunities for the investigation. They started tracking financial flows, linking them to international banking transactions. But even that turned out to be more challenging than expected. One day, just as Marianne had almost lost all hope, she received an unexpected message. It was a letter with no return address, instructing her to meet the sender in one of Toronto's parks. The letter claimed that the sender knew the truth about Paul and Rebecca, and that Marianne had to come alone, without the police. Fear and curiosity battled within her, but she decided to take the risk. On the appointed day, she arrived at the park, her heart pounding. She looked around, trying to figure out who might have sent her the letter. After a few minutes, a man in a hood approached her, his face half hidden. He introduced himself as an old friend of Paul's and said he had information that could help. He told her that Paul had gotten involved in a dangerous game with a major criminal network and that Rebecca was likely coerced into participating. The man didn't have much time to explain. He was visibly nervous and kept looking around. He said they were being watched and that Marianne needed to be very careful. He handed her a flash drive with some data and quickly disappeared into the crowd. Marianne didn't know what to do, so she immediately went to the police and handed over the flash drive. The data on the flash drive turned out to be a real breakthrough. It contained financial documents showing large transactions linked to criminal organizations. This information helped the police track down several key figures who had previously remained in the shadows. But even with this new evidence, the investigation didn't progress as quickly as they had hoped. Each step took time, and the clues were too convoluted. Meanwhile, Marianne understood that her life would never return to normal. She had lost trust in everyone around her, and felt like she could no longer rely on anyone. Her hopes that Rebecca would come back and explain everything dwindled with each passing day. She realized that her sister might forever remain on the other side, the side of darkness and betrayal. The investigation continued to struggle, despite everyone's efforts. It seemed like every new detail only made the overall picture more complicated. The police worked tirelessly, but the true motivations behind Paul's actions and his connection to criminal circles remained a mystery. Rebecca had seemingly vanished into thin air, and no one knew if she was alive or had become another victim of those she had associated with. Marianne increasingly thought about starting a new life, leaving everything behind, and trying to find herself in a world that felt so cold and hostile. But she knew that until the truth was revealed, she wouldn't be able to move on. Her life had become a battle for justice, a battle for the truth, a battle for her own future, which now seemed so uncertain and distant. Marianne stood by the window of her apartment, gazing out at the gray streets of Toronto. A light autumn rain tapped against the glass, as if it wanted to break through and seep inside, much like the new disturbing events that had torn her world apart. Evenings had become a time when fears and doubts overwhelmed her with their weight. Every creak, every phone ring made her shudder. Since the police had arrested Paul, her life had turned into a nightmare, and any hope that it would end quickly had proven illusory. The next morning, Marianne received a message from the detective in charge of her husband's case. They urgently needed to talk because new information had come to light. She hurriedly got ready and headed to the police station, unsure of what to expect. Deep inside, fear consumed her. The fear that everything was about to get even worse than she had imagined. Detective Sergeant Brown met her at the office door. He looked tired, his eyes red from lack of sleep, and files were stacked high on his desk. He gestured for her to take a seat and began explaining the new information. It seemed that Paul was involved in something far darker than they had initially thought. Last night, agents gained access to several hidden records from a warehouse Paul had rented. Human remains were found there, apparently hidden for several months. Marianne felt the world start spinning around her. She couldn't believe her ears. Human remains in Paul's warehouse. Fear and horror overwhelmed her as the detective showed her photographs. The images depicted dark and eerie scenes, a dusty storage space, a metal container wrapped in chains, and what was clearly human remains, wrapped in heavy plastic material. The police suspected Paul was involved in organized crime, possibly related to human trafficking or something even worse. The container was outfitted like a holding cell to keep someone captive. Paul's connections to known criminal elements were under investigation, and it seemed that Rebecca might also be involved. Marianne felt her heart tighten with dread. Rebecca, her sister, whom she loved and trusted, could be involved in something so despicable. Her mind refused to accept this as reality. The police continued to share new details. It turned out that the container found in the warehouse had been used to transport people. Inside, traces of blood were found, indicating violent restraint. Personal items, small charms, photographs were also discovered, likely belonging to victims. These findings led the police to suspect that the warehouse wasn't only used for storing money and documents, but also for holding people against their will. Among Paul's belongings, they found a video recording featuring Paul and several unidentified individuals at the warehouse. They were discussing something that clearly involved shipments. The conversations were cold and calculating, with no hint of empathy or doubt. The police believed Paul was a middleman, handling logistics, organizing transport, and covering tracks. But he was clearly not the main player. Someone higher up was pulling the strings, and this person appeared ready to do anything to keep their operation secret. While the police worked to uncover all the details, Marianne remembered all the small things that had seemed odd before, but hadn't raised serious suspicion. Late-night calls, sudden trips, strange phone conversations that stopped when she entered the room. Now all these details formed a chilling picture. Her entire life had crumbled in an instant, leaving nothing but emptiness and pain. The police had struggled for some time to track down Rebecca, but after receiving an anonymous tip about her whereabouts, they managed to locate her. The operation to arrest her took place in a remote area of Toronto, where Rebecca had been hiding in a rented apartment. The police surrounded the building at night to avoid unnecessary noise and attention. Rebecca offered no resistance when the SWAT team burst in. She looked exhausted, and she knew her escape had come to an end. Months after Paul's arrest, the trial of Paul and Rebecca finally began. The case drew media attention, with reporters covering every stage in detail. The courthouse was surrounded by cameras and microphones as they documented the shocking story that had shaken the entire nation. The police hadn't managed to capture all those involved, but the gathered evidence allowed the prosecution to build a solid case. Marianne, sitting in the courtroom, felt her hands tremble from anxiety. She was witnessing the trial of two people she once loved and considered close. She looked at her younger sister, who sat on the defendant's bench, avoiding Marianne's gaze. Rebecca looked pale and exhausted, her eyes empty as if she had lost all hope. Paul sat beside her, his face expressionless, barely reacting to anything happening around him. The prosecution presented numerous pieces of evidence: testimonies from witnesses, financial documents, video footage, and items found in the warehouse all painted a disturbing picture of Paul and Rebecca's activities. Detective Brown, speaking in court, described the details of the investigation, revealing how Paul had used his position to organize a criminal scheme, how he and Rebecca rented a warehouse, and how they were both involved in human trafficking and money laundering. When it was the defense attorney's turn, they tried to portray Rebecca as a victim of circumstances, arguing that she had been misled by Paul and forced to participate in his actions under threats. They emphasized her youth and naivety, attempting to gain sympathy from the jury. However, the evidence spoke for itself. Numerous conversations, in which Rebecca actively discussed the details of their deals, showed she was fully aware of what she was getting into. Paul, on the other hand, refused to testify, and his lawyers argued that there wasn't enough evidence to prove the human trafficking charges. They claimed the financial transactions were part of a legitimate business and that the items found in the warehouse could have been planted. But neither the judge nor the jury found these arguments convincing. Too much evidence pointed to Paul and Rebecca being active participants rather than innocent bystanders. During the trial, Marianne was called to the stand as a witness. She had to recount all the details she knew about Paul and Rebecca, describing how she had discovered their conversations, her suspicions, and how she handed everything over to the authorities. This was the hardest part for her. She had to look into her sister's eyes and tell the truth, knowing her words could be crucial to the verdict. Rebecca avoided her gaze, and Marianne could see how her sister clenched her hands, struggling not to break down. The trial lasted for several weeks. The prosecution provided enough evidence to convince the jury of Paul and Rebecca's guilt. When the judge announced that the jury was ready to deliver the verdict, a tense silence fell over the courtroom. Marianne sat, holding her breath, her heart pounding wildly. She knew this moment would be a turning point in her life, regardless of what the verdict would be. The jury found Paul guilty on all charges: organizing a criminal network, human trafficking, money laundering, and complicity in a violent act. He faced life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Rebecca was found guilty of being an accomplice, but she managed to avoid a life sentence thanks to her defense's arguments and her confession. The judge sentenced her to 20 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. When the verdict was announced, Marianne felt a mixture of relief and pain. On one hand, she knew that justice had been served and that those responsible would pay for their actions. On the other, she had lost her sister and her husband, people she once loved. At that moment, she realized that her life would never be the same again, and that she would now have to learn to live anew, starting from scratch. After the trial, Marianne approached Rebecca, who stood in handcuffs, surrounded by guards. They locked eyes, and in that moment, there were too many unspoken words between them. Marianne didn't know if she could ever forgive her sister for everything that had happened, but there was no hatred in her eyes, only deep sadness and disappointment. Rebecca quietly whispered, "Forgive me," and those words echoed in Marianne's mind as they took her sister away. The weeks that followed were a time of reflection for Marianne, a period of trying to figure out how to move forward. She left Toronto, leaving behind all the memories of the past, and settled in a small town where no one knew her. She started a new job, made new friends, but the memories of what had happened still haunted her. Sometimes she had nightmares, reliving the horrors over and over again, but over time, the pain began to fade. Marianne found support in the people around her and in her desire to help others. She began working at a charity that helped victims of human trafficking. She decided that the only way to find peace was to do everything in her power to help those who found themselves in similar situations. Her life was different now, full not only of pain and loss, but also of hope. Marianne learned to forgive, though it took her a long time to find the strength to do so. She never forgot her sister, and despite everything, she still believed that one day they might talk again and find a path to reconciliation. But for now, she needed to move on, to live her life, and not look back. The trial and the verdict had put an end to one of the darkest chapters of her life, but there were new pages ahead, and Marianne was ready to fill them with something good and meaningful. She knew her journey was just beginning, and that there would be many challenges ahead, but now she was prepared for them. She had faced the worst, and that had made her stronger.